Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever you may be. Welcome to our business continuity panel. Today, we're going to hear from some of our industry leaders on how they're planning for the future in the middle of a pandemic. A quick housekeeping. We're doing this meeting in Zoom meeting mode. So if you do have any questions or comment, you can ask them yourself. Either if you raise your hand or raise your hand in the window. You can do that by going to the panelist and going to more, and then you'll see a raise hand option. So you can ask your questions yourself by raising your hand. If you don't want to do that, then please feel free to ask it in the chat, and we'll be keeping an eye on that as well. So without further ado, I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves. First of all, let's start with Kurtis.
Hi, I'm Kurtis Lindqvist. I'm on the board of EuroX, and I'm also the CEO of LINX.
Thank you. CK.
Hi, I'm CK. I'm working for Akamai, heading the network technology department, so everything around peering networks, routers, switches, that kind of stuff.
And Nina. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about the muting. I have my my house is being power hosed today, and just right now as we begin this, they're taking this section with the window where I am. So apologies for any background noise. I am Nina. I am working for Subspace. Subspace is a new startup that started last year. I'm heading the network development group for EMEA, and this is the group that is planning where we want to build, who we want to locate, connect to, and negotiating the connectivity and the transport to the POPs. Subspace is a network focused on low latency, low jitter services, such as multiplayer control traffic. That's me.
Valeria.
Hi, good morning to everybody. I am Valeria Rossi. I am the General Manager of the Milan Internet Exchange and the President of OpenAhmed, a new pole of telecommunication for South Europe and the Mediterranean area.
Thank you. Thank you, and all. Thank you very much for joining us on this panel today. I think EuroX at the beginning of the pandemic started to have these regular meetings on sharing ideas and how IXPs were managing during the early days of lockdown. And the conversations in around July, August time started turning into where are we heading? What is the future going to look like? Because we're not seeing much change in terms of lockdowns going around in Europe and globally, and there's still so much uncertainty. So the idea of this panel is to get some insight from some of our leaders and hear from them how they've been planning for 2021. And with that, I'm going to start with the first question, and that's going to go to Kurtis. So Kurtis, what changes have you made when you're budgeting for 2021 when it comes to operations, member relations, travel, and are you having to include some level of flexibility in case things change, if they get worse or if they suddenly improve and we can all start going back to where we are? How are you doing that?
So I think there's a few aspects to this. One is the cost side, where we obviously don't assume there's going to be any travel or large-scale events, at least the first half of the year. I think it's looking doubtful to be in the second half of the year, but our assumption is that around June we'll be back on somewhat normal schedule. That was our contingency planning. So that's sort of flexibility we built into the to travel and so on. But I think what we also have had to deal with is the outlook of how do we engage with members and prospects and anyone coming to LINX outside our usual conference schedule, because that won't happen. So we have had to look at other ways of dealing with this and plan for that. I think that's there's a little uncertainty, so you make contingency planning, and you reserve for that. But how you actually going to use this is going to be a very dynamic place going forward. We have also assumed that we can continue to do network operations, etc. We were lucky in that sense in the UK that we remained access to data centers throughout the pandemic, because we're critical national infrastructure. We have assumed that these works will continue, and if that's going to be the case, who knows, but we hope so. During the pandemic, we have mostly dealt with emergencies, capacity upgrades, or fixing, but we are assuming we can go on with equipment changes, rebuilds, etc. Next year. Is that going to be the case? We don't know, but that's an assumption we made. On the income side, this is actually much more interesting, quite more difficult. We have, as everybody else, we saw this massive influx of orders in March, and that drew a lot of capacity growth. We are trying to judge and have discussion with the members. Is these orders that are being placed early, or is this we're going to see any growth next year at all? I mean, that's a very open-ended question, and it is very hard. At the same time, we have made provision for some growth, probably more conservative than we have done other years. We have also taken a very conservative outlook on cash flow. We do worry of the wider macroeconomic situation. We know from the early start of the pandemic that smaller members who were either very business focused or had businesses very tied in and got very severely affected by the pandemic, they really struggled to survive. We probably were as accommodating as we could be, but if this will start becoming a very long-term effect, and then this will start having cash flow issues for us and for them. Now we're lucky that the larger members are where most of our cash flow comes from, but we still have to make some sort of provisions for what will happen in the wider economy. What will happen if we start seeing mass layoffs, extended furlough schemes. So as long as we're on furlough schemes, there is still cash in circulation in the economy. But if that dries up, as for example in the UK has been flagged, then what is the wider impact on spend and how will that affect our membership is very unclear, but it's an added uncertainty. We have tried to keep much more on top and closer discussion with debtors around this to have a sense of why this is, what's actually happening. This might be also, we did notice that in the early days of the pandemic, we did see the debtors increase because you didn't have the usual accounts payable departments in the office and so on, and that delayed payments, and we want to make sure we stay on top of that going forward as well. So there's a whole range of planning that's going in for next year, but our general assumption is that we will see a pandemic for the first half of the year, and then we'll see a gradual return to normal. But we have been much more conservative in our approach, especially because we don't know if we will see any growth next year. I think that's the biggest unclarity at the moment, is what will actually happen there, and what will this look like. And I think that's a uncertainty we have to take into account. Indications is that we'll still see growth when we talk to our members, but we don't want to assume that growth because of the risk that would come with.
Thanks. That's there's a lot to think about. CK, have you got anything to add to that when it comes to budgeting and planning for 2021?
Probably just one or two sentences. I think the biggest spike, which was clearly the one in March, was like a step function, something which brought us at a new plateau. But from then on, and what we kind of expect for the future, I think it is back to regular growth numbers. I wouldn't say that it slows down, or that's not necessarily our prediction either, but certainly no jump or no accelerated growth. So I think from the new level, it's going forward as in the past.
Yeah. Nina.
I think our situation is, is a little bit different than that of an internet exchange, because we are building out right now, and so our growth is more coming from adding customers. But we also think that, you know, the type of customers and the type of traffic that we're aiming at, that traffic has growth on the internet right now, with more people needing to stay at home. They get bored. What can they do? Well, they can play on their computer, and that's what we are trying to make better. So ours is a little bit more of a positive story, I think, on this. If we can manage to build out our network fast enough to actually be of help.
Yeah, thanks, Valeria.
Well, about different strategies. Yes, we are doing something different, but it's not exclusively related to the emergency situation. Part, in fact, is due to the change that took place in MIX at the end of May, when the board has been completely renewed. But this is another story. With regard to the action related to the pandemic, certainly many arguments are being made related to the major economic difficulties facing companies. Also, we know that the ICT and network sectors are fields that suffers the crisis as a result of the lockdown. Somebody says that the wave of the first phase of the economic crisis created by the first lockdown should be felt in the telco world in the first half of year 2021, but it will depend on future effects. And so we will see what will happen. We are keeping flexibility in our budget, and we are changing, for example, the way to invoice small customers to help them to have the cash to pay us.
Yeah, there's a lot more. I think we found this in the early days as well. Is that I guess the relationship with the members or customers is is key at this time to make sure that you can help each other out. Thanks for those. Moving on to the next question, and this one I've got for CK. Are your discussions around strategy for 2021 different to previous years, and is the lack of meeting people physically affecting how you normally plan? And you know, in that same regard, what are you doing to keep connected to your customers and members?
Thanks. If I compare 2021 with right now, then to be honest, there are not any changes really, right? In a way, we continue what we have started, and the biggest changes in difference between the years is certainly behind us, whatever that might have been, right? Supply chain, emphasis on distributed work, see that everybody can work, don't overwork themselves, less reliance on the headquarter, which is always good for an American company anyway. This is, of course, different than 2020 or so, but whatever stage we have now arrived at, I don't think we change that. Certainly not till like mid of next year. I guess that goes similar to what Kurtis said. The big companies, and I guess you have seen it with like Google and some others as well. I think everybody expects till like June next year. This is home office world, distributed world, not many travel, if at all, no conferences. So I guess that's our new reality in which we are right now. On the other side, we changed some parts, which is, as we talked budget, and not traveling frees up some money from the travel. So we try to put a little bit of emphasis on training as much as they were online, virtual. People do technical certification, that kind of stuff, where usually, you know, there's probably not as much time. And now with, for some people, less travel, there are a little bit more flexibility and certainly the money to execute on that part. Coming to your second question, which was about the lack of meeting people, that's interesting, and I thought a little bit about that. So in the beginning, like the first 1 to 3 months, it actually didn't feel really different than before, because you were talking with the people you already know. So whatever relationships you have built up in the industry, whatever friendships you have, you kind of could cash out on them, right? Now, as time goes by and you haven't seen them for 6 months, it feels a little bit less cohesive. But I think the people who were traveling extensively before and had the interactions, you can benefit from that now. I think it is difficult or different, and looking forward to Nina's comment, for either new relationships, especially if you have an onboarding. So we had a new person onboarding as well, which thanks God we already knew, but you know, now the person has to get a computer, has to log in, you can't meet them in the office and stuff like that. So I guess the onboarding will now be longer than in the past. Also, if you have a new business relationship, I think it's more difficult. And, you know, this is now, I don't know, the 5th webinar, and certainly, you know, I have like 5 or 6 hours of video every day. So if you have content, or if you have transactional meetings, I think they work quite well via video. If it's a new person, or you have to transport some emotions or understanding of the person, video filters so much that it is not always clear if you are now on the same page with the other person or not. So that makes it certainly way more difficult. So I don't think that as an overall industry, the video part will be a replacement for the future. It can probably take care about some of the aspects, especially if they're transactional, but I don't think that relationship building over videos and email is at the same level. Also, you know, nobody makes a hallway conversation. There's no video chat room hallway where someone just drops in and has a random chat, or you bump into someone, right? You have to schedule something. You have to have a meeting. You have to put it in a calendar. The other person has to have time. So everything about being spontaneous, I think, is down the drain. Coming to your last part about how do we stay connected, well, videos, as I said, I think is the majority of the part to get at least some interaction between the people. What I try to do is having more regular and short ones, see that, you know, you have some cadence with people. And now, whatever, some of us here in the call, I would have just waited till I next time bump into them in a conference. Now, if I need something, I actually be more stringent with the scheduling and say, yeah, I should catch up with that one and that one every 3 months, so that we don't lose sight completely. So again, being spontaneous really goes down. But I think if you put them in your schedule, as I said, and if you don't forget their birthdays and send them WhatsApp messages and stuff like that, I think you can stay in contact. So can make the best out of the technologies which we build.
Yeah, thanks, EK. I think it's yeah. I'm also looking forward to hearing what Nina has to say on this. You know, I think with you know, starting a new well, a startup, it definitely has its challenges anyway. Yeah. So how are you? I mean, obviously you can't compare to previous years, but you know, from your experience in other organizations, do you feel, you know, well, first of all, it's a startup, so it's different, and then secondly, you know, the relationships and I guess the lack of the physical meetings. How's that, do you think, affecting the whole startup?
No, it definitely makes part of the work more challenging. That's absolutely true. Funnily enough, I also think it makes some of it a little bit easier, and that's because this is an American startup. It started out in Los Angeles. There is an office in Los Angeles. Right now, people can go in if they, you know, research, is anybody else in there, and they can go in like maybe 3 or 4 people at the time. But otherwise, you know, there is no expectation that people will go to office until, you know, sometime late next year. at the same time, the company, we are hiring a lot of people. And right now we're hiring all over the world. So comparing to what I've done before, getting hired as one of the first persons in Europe to an American company, even an American company where a large group of my colleagues were working from homes and used to being on video for connecting. It was still a little bit of, oh no, you're really far away, you're on the video, everybody else is sitting in a meeting room, and having that difficulty in assess yourself and being known to people, hey, we are also here and have a voice. Now with everybody being on video, that part is easier. We still have the time zone issues and all of that. But just the presence is equal for everyone, because we're all sitting in this little square on the screen, and not 10 people in a meeting room and 3 people in a square on a screen that people forget to look at, or they bring up the meeting agenda on the screen, and then you completely forget that there are people on the screen as well. So that in that way, it's actually a little bit of a help. Where we really face challenges is we're in the business of building new relationships to ISPs all over the world, to IXPs, and that is definitely a challenge because we do not have the events to go out and meet. One way that we're coming about it is hiring smartly. So one criteria to getting hired into my group has been, do you come with these contacts already? Or is this somebody who has to go out and build up the contacts? If we have one with the contacts and one without the contacts and everything else is looking the same, we're definitely picking the one with the contacts even more than we would have before. And so as CK mentioned, we're really cashing out of all the social debt that we put in the bank over drinks for the past 10 years, right? And it's about time also, I feel the same way as CK said, it's about time to be a little bit more structured in keeping these connections warm and not just go away, disappear into, sitting in my own little living room. And then there is, because we're building, right now we have probably 10 builds, maybe 15 builds going on at the same time in various parts of the world. And it's definitely a challenge for the teams trying to coordinate local hands and with everything running a little bit lower speed than it did before because of COVID and because of restrictions. And because we're not just sending people traveling all over the world to install ourselves, we really don't want to do that anyways. It does make builds more challenging than it were before, I think. So that's also definitely an issue.
Thank you. Valeria, how are your discussions around strategy for 2021? Are they different to previous years? And how are you finding the lack of meetings affecting your business and keeping connected to members and customers?
Well, I think that it's very clear that COVID highlighted how it is necessary to review methods in communicating with the outside world and with our members too. By Mix, for example, we are developing a new marketing and communication plan aimed also at a more effective and more engaging communication with our members. let's consider that before COVID, many of our customers used to come in our offices and visit us, even just to have a coffee, for example. And this also, if from an organizational point of view, it was a bit dispersed, allowed us to have a more active interpersonal relationship with them. Now, I don't know, perhaps we would have to introduce moments like coffee break via Zoom, I don't know, just to bring those moments of interaction into virtual reality. But the biggest problem is what is already mentioned by the others, is that the commercial approach is delayed. And it is not clear the same that I have a meeting one-to-one and talk with people. So I hope, for many reasons, I hope that this period, unfortunate period, finish very, very soon.
Yeah, yeah, I hope so too. My next question is actually for Nina, and we're going back to your startup. So, you know, you've already discussed some of the challenges that you've had with the startup and you know, starting a startup in the midst of a pandemic. What other big challenges would you say you've had over the last year? I mean, and some of these may not be just because of the pandemic, or some of these might have been amplified because of the pandemic.
Well, another thing that's rather difficult is that, you know, is hiring. Like CK mentioned it, you know, onboarding. I have this one new person starting in my team, and onboarding is going to take longer. So we are hiring. So when I joined Subspace in June. I was number something 40 in the company. We are close to reaching 100 now. None of us have met any of these people.
Wow.
Right. We may have met them before because we might have hired people that some people knew, but a lot of people have you never met in person, right? And we're hiring people without meeting them in person and getting all the information that you get when you have that one-to-one conversation in person, as opposed to having the one-to-one conversations over video that we are hiring people on the basis of. So there's a risk here of you know, both missing out on talent because we're not clicking on the video, and there's a risk on hiring the wrong persons because we're clicking on the video, but it turns out the person was an asshole. And I think there's a third risk, which really concerns me, is, you know, hiring the people you know. You know, maybe we're missing out on the diversity of thought that you know, we actually really want. Because it's safer, and definitely in this situation, much safer to hire somebody that we know can do the job. And it's probably for us in being a rapidly growing company and you know, is what we need, somebody that we do know is a little bit like myself, but in the longer run, we really need diversity of thought. So I think that's one of the big challenges we have right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, a question to that actually. So Nina, you come from a company which had put an emphasis on culture, as you know, American companies do in general. So how do you introduce a culture when you haven't even met the people? Do you just hand out a slide deck? That's our culture. Live with it. Stay, move on, or do you say we grow so fast we don't actually have time for that? We catch up on that later. What do you guys do in that regard?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we're still so young that we do not have a culture deck. I'm not sure we want to have a culture deck. You know, having the culture deck in my previous company grow from the 127 slides to a 10 pages Google Doc with no pictures. That's not where we're heading in this company. But there's definitely a challenge on how do we get the right culture with everybody, and particularly hiring so many people. It's already a huge challenge, and then hiring people that we're not meeting. It's difficult, and I think it is definitely, a little bit on, well, this is something we probably may have to fix later. And again, I mean, and this, we also have to understand the American mentality when it comes to hiring, which is quite different from what we do in this part of the world, right? Europe. Because in America, it is much more common to go, yeah, I hire this person in, and then I fire them again, if necessary. Here, it seems to me that we take that less lightly in this part of the world, where it is a calculated risk in US. Hire fast, fire fast was actually also something that was in my previous job, and it is also something that we think we have in here. So, and maybe that's also a little bit the nature of a startup. I haven't done startups before, but you are so busy, so you bring in people that can do exactly what you, and then we can think about later if they fit.
Mm-hmm.
Though we do have a very strict do not hire jerks policy, so that one is in place.
That's your culture slide.
No jerks. It is, yeah. No, it is. We do have, in our we run the. I don't know how people hire, but we run the, a manager's screen, and then we run a panel, talk to four or five people, and one of those persons that is interviewing the candidate has the job of doing the culture fit assessment, right? So there is definitely a probe being done, is will this person fit into how we believe that we're working and how we believe the culture is. And we do have some relatively well-defined on, values on being able to make decisions and act fast, love what we do and feel that what the company is doing is really important and be dedicated to do that. But it is definitely more fluffy than I, but also I think Netflix is probably rather special with the culture work.
No, interesting. I think as well that it's going to be, like you said, you're hiring now, and then you'll see how it all works out. I mean, you do that anyway when you hire somebody. You have your trial period and assessments and so forth. So I guess in that regard, it's not that different. But obviously, not meeting that person face to face, I think, you lose a lot of the personal touch as well, don't you?
Yeah, I think. Well, if I just I have one thing I want to say is, I think one part of the culture that is also being very openly talked about is transparency. And I think maybe in particular when we're not meeting in person that often, making sure that information is flowing to everyone, that everyone knows about these are the customers we're going for right now, or these are the customers we have, and this is what is happening, this is how our economics are. Everybody being aware of that gives you that kind of connectivity and ownership into the company that I think you can be difficult to build up because we're all remote, but getting the information, helps people to feel ownership. I am part of this, right? So I think I really like the way of running companies like that. It's you look at Netflix, they do it the same way. The transparency is a big part of Netflix's success, I believe. And I myself feel that way, with the fact that I know how the books are, makes my feeling of ownership with the company bigger. Not just the paycheck that comes every month.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to look at it. Yeah. Valeria, I mean, do you have anything you want to add to that? I mean, obviously you're not any of like Nina's challenges or.
No, I haven't to add in particular. I mean, it's a big challenge for her, but she's strong. So, and surely the matters related to hiring people is a huge one. We are doing it, but we are not in the same situation of Nina is, because we are hiring within our country, within our town. We are still going in the office, into the office for a couple of days per week. So we have the way to meet each other at least a little bit, even if the interview are made by Zoom and so on. But we are in a totally different situation. So good luck to Nina.
Kurtis, do you have anything to?
Yeah, but I want to touch on it because I was going to say this on the previous question, but before we moved on. But I don't think that there's been much change in strategy as per se in as a result of COVID. I don't think that changes fundamentally, but what there's added to dimension, and that is to look after staff, and it goes through culture, but not just like Nina. We've hired quite a lot of people, and during this, because of replacement and so on, and some of them have never met any of us, right? They have never actually met a LINX employee, and it's very, very interesting. I actually think the culture in these times is key to this. I mean, there's this saying that culture is strategy, right? And I think you can have the best strategy in the world if you don't have a company culture to back that up and execute on it. Then that strategy is not going to work, right? You need to have the cohesiveness of a team to deliver, right? You can drive people hard, but that's not going to be a long-term strategy, and long-term culture is not going to work, right? And onboarding people into this culture and retaining culture is actually very, very hard during these times. And I think I firmly believe that we actually started doing a lot of work on culture and around this before in December. So it was just before the pandemic. We have worked through that with the teams quite a lot about what does it mean, how do we live this? And I think, Nina said transparency. I think transparency is one very aspect of it, but it's also accountability and delegation, right? And people should feel ownership of the issues being given, that they actually control this and they can take responsibility for this, but also you had a right to hold people to account. And we talked a lot about this and the values that comes with that and around, and how they build this culture. We have continued that work throughout the pandemic. It's been much harder to do this through Zoom calls and video calls, because you lose, as CK said, you lose a lot of nuances, you lose a lot of the discussions around that, and that is much harder, right? But we still do. We have the different teams have had quiz. We have had a Friday quiz running. We have had and that might sound very trivial, but I think it's very important as part of this cohesiveness, and also that you don't give up on the values and the culture just because you can't see each other. You should still be able to hold people accountable for the values and the culture you aspire for, even in a pandemic, right? You shouldn't just go like, oh, well, it doesn't matter anymore. I think it matters more now than ever, right, to create that cohesiveness. But it's very hard to bring this on board with new people who start, right? It's because they haven't been part of this, they haven't seen this. We have done quite a lot of few things around this to try to bring this on board. I try to continue with this. I think it's also the other part of the culture, which is very much part of the culture, is this, that we have to look after staff in these times, right? Everyone is different. Everyone had different, family life and circumstances, and you need to try to accommodate them and deal with them. You to some extent you're constrained with what lockdown rules and other rules throughout this time, but it is very important to deal with that. And we've been trying to work around this and both capture the well-being and status and needs of staff, and make sure we can address that as much as we can, right? Because that is very much part of the culture. If you don't, that is the the flip side of me, that's like Nina says, you get a paycheck, but it's also, if I don't care about staff, I can only ask them for so much, right? And I think that's a very important part of this part about culture strategy for breakfast, right? It is hard to do that, right? But as a challenge, I think it's going to be even more challenging if we head for a winter with a harsh lockdown again, and we look forward to another 6 months. Seekers here will get even longer, but we need to you need to support staff through this. You need to work with this, right? And that is hard. Right? I mean, I think school closures and so on. If that happens again, that's going to be as an employer, we need to deal with that. We need to support staff going through that.
Right? Yeah. CK, have you got anything to add there?
No.
No. We've got a couple of comments in the chat, which I'm just going to read out. From one from Michelle. Absolutely, transparency is key and does make everyone feel part of the team. CK is asking, is that more important in COVID times or the same? Nina's replied, I think so, because the palette of tools to create ownership is smaller. Yeah, and I guess especially for a startup. And Michelle says, no, it's the same. During COVID, more communications is key. Transparency should always be part of the culture, with or without a pandemic. Yeah, I think I totally agree. I think communication and I think you kind of forget how important it is, especially when you don't see people. Okay, my next question is going to Valeria. Lessons learned. What lessons have you learned in 2020 that will change the way you do business in the future?
Well, the first lessons in some way are related to what we are talking right now, and covers an aspect that was impactful for me and made me think how sometimes the choice of priorities makes you postpone too much some activities, and I did it. And activities that in the immediate future may not be dysfunctional, but that when an event, and a sudden event occurs, like COVID was, it backfires. And this is a mea culpa that I did, and I want to explain you. The fact is that COVID has highlighted our mix bugs in internal communication. I take a step back to explain. Mix is a company that has always had the staff contained in size. Taking into account that, as you know, at Mix we provide both the typical services of an IX and in parallel also co-location services inside our own data center. So even if co-location is not our core business, it's a service that is provided completely with internal resources and with the technological system of our property. Therefore, everything related to the maintenance and upgrade of the data center, installation and customer support services, the H24 availability with our own staff are managed by the Mix staff itself. And of course, in parallel, we have all the operations, planning, support, and monitoring activities, and so on related to the peering services. Now, you have to know that for about the first 15 years, Mix has had a very small staff, which has grown from 3 to 8 people in 17 years, including me, I mean. And only in the last 3 years, we started to hire more people, and we have finally a CCO and CTO, but until then, all the organizational chain was very flat. There was me, and then the operational staff. And therefore, every decision passed through me. And there is where I, with transparency, made a mistake. Being few and all of us already present in the offices, internal communication was streamlined, immediate. The procedure were historically known for experience on the field, and any variation was easily set up and easily communicated internally. If you have a doubt, you just went to the next office. But obviously, during the lockdown, even if everyone was always connected, the immediacy was totally lost, of course, and the lack of method on internal passage of some information came to surface. I had given less priority to the formalization of internal communication in favor of dedicating myself to the functionality of LINX, thing which I was aware of and which I had already begun to work on. But with COVID, this exploded in my hands and revealed itself as an organizational bug. So, of course, now we are working with a target to improve the flow of communication between us, but surely this aspect has clearly raised the difference between office at work, work at office and smart working. Dedicating time to enable everyone in staff to be able to read the procedures and to be updated in real time and quickly on what is being done in the other internal areas is time saving and an improvement of efficiency in general. To tell the truth, during the COVID, we had no delivery problems, service delivery problems. The mixed staff did an excellent job. We were no malfunctions. We worked well and a lot. There was some understandable delay more related to the delivery of materials, but the flow of communication between us must certainly be improved for the benefit of the work organization. And so this is covered, almost covered. And I think that the other lesson that we shared is that we can share together is that you can work just, this is a positive message, you can work just as well as in smart working as you did before in the office. That is not necessary to spend our life traveling abroad or spending time to go to the office. And also it's preferable and easier to meet face-to-face a lot, and good can also be done by organizing smart working properly with all the related advantages. For example, hiring worldwide collaborators. This is a good point, even if we heard about all the difficulties around. Reduction in transfer costs, better use of our time, of staff time, and of course, quality of personal life. I think that, in other words, the lockdown period has greatly revolutionized our personal and professional life, and I think that it would be foolish if not value its positive points, the few one that there are in this bad situation.
Thanks, Valeria. Before I move to Kurtis with that question, Eileen has her hand raised. I think that might have been for the previous question, but please go ahead.
It was, but actually what Valeria said there is very interesting. I'm wondering what tools you do use for that internal communication, Valeria. Is that a matter of creating processes for how information moves around the organization, or is it regular team meetings over Zoom, or is it more missives on email, or what tools do you actually use to make that happen? And do you set specific times every week for that to happen, or is it more as things happen you then respond? So my other question was to do with finances, so perhaps we'll come after the others have answered this question.
Well, we are improving our. Certainly, we are. I'm started to write internal procedure just to pass information from one area to another one. We are populating much more our wiki, internal wiki, with documentation, and we are organizing Zoom meeting in this period, and when we will return in the office, my target is organize more meeting and I organized Zoom rooms creating the offices. So, for example, the administration, its own room, and so on. And we are trying, and this is work quite well. We are trying to emulate our life in the office within the Zoom in the different one. So I don't go in another office, I just connect in another room. Of course, it's not as the immediacy, of course, is not the same, but we manage it quite well.
Thanks. Kurtis, a few lessons learned. What lessons have you learned in 2020 that will change the way you do business in the future?
Well, I mean, I guess the context of this is in relation to COVID, which is a bit interesting in itself. But I think there's a few things. One is that, I mean, to the question about communication tools, this is not directly related to COVID, but I think it emphasized it a bit, was that we're using a scaled agile approach. So we have an agile planning for all the work we do and how we implement this internally. And so we had the challenge of deploying this in the parallel with COVID, which was a little bit interesting and quite a challenge early on, actually. I think we just now doing the last quarterly iteration of the PI iteration, and it's actually gone quite really well the fourth time. You know, we've done it 4 times, so we sort of learn. But the tools around this, when it comes to dependencies and communication and so on, has really helped us in that sense in working. Now, this would have happened even without COVID, but I think it highlighted and emphasized this a lot more because of the lack of interaction in the offices. So a little bit the same as Valeria said, and I think that put a lot more emphasis on what we did, and we have been forced to try to really use the tools around this to make this work, and I think that's really come out of the COVID. The other thing that was very interesting for us is that it made us test our business continuity processes very early on, of course, and on the whole, I think that worked. You know, we didn't necessarily have extremely detailed pandemic planning. We do now, but I'm hoping we're not going to have more pandemics anytime soon. I think this one has been quite enough. But so I think there's a whole aspect around this. But I do think coming back to this about the culture and the importance of maintaining team cohesiveness and is quite interesting. I think the lesson learned is going to be the challenge going forward is, of course, what is the new normal? What is that looking like? And that's something we're spending a lot of time on at the moment, is what does this mean? You know, when are we going to go back to an office? You know, how are we going to go back to an office? Is anyone ever going to go back to an office? And if we don't do that, what does that mean? And how do we maintain this going forward? And offices will probably going to be more the collaboration space going forward, and less as the daily go-to. Some staff definitely want to go to the office because of you know, home situation, home environment, whatever, and they should be, you know, we have to cater for that as well. So there's a mix of concerns to take into account there. We need to make that all work, and I think that's the challenge going forward. I don't have the answer. We're doing this right now, but that will definitely be one of the lessons going forward. Is this new normal? I'd be massively surprised if we all went back to work in 9 to 5 in an office as we did in the past. I simply don't think that's going to happen, right? And I think this is going to, you know, we have learned to use a lot more tools, both for planning, for you know, people very task-driven planning, like the agile model, but also just in discussions like this, you know, the Zoom calls, the Friday pub quizzes, the whatever, you know, that's. We have a lot more tools around that as well. We're using our chat functions much more, and you know, we've become better at that. But I do think where you do miss something, and that is in the more creative side, innovation side, to actually get together and have that level of interaction. I think this is not as effective, and as the CK say, you miss a little bit more that spontaneous. You know, water cooler discussions about innovations, or dropping by someone's desk to ask something. I mean, that becomes you do lose that. So I think the new normal somehow will need to involve. We need to incorporate some level of this, but it's probably going to be a lot more fluent and a lot more spontaneous and than we've done in the past.
Yeah. Thanks, Kurtis. CK, have you got anything to add there?
Sure. So when you actually asked the question, what is a lesson learned? I thought, yeah, what was actually the lesson learned? I'm not sure if there is a particular lesson or, you know, something which is fundamentally different than what we did before. I think for me, it is more like there are one or two things where probably the emphasis or the focus has changed, and not all of them are solved by any definition. A quick entertaining one and then the complicated one. The entertaining one is, well, it turns out, you know, you order your servers in China or wherever you get them, but the parts are actually coming from different parts of the world, which you were not aware. So if countries go at the lockdown at various times, your server might be ready, but something else from a different country, which is right now in lockdown, just opposite timing, isn't delivered. So I guess you learn a lot about supply chain. But the more complicated one is, so we all said that communication is important for employees and we do the meetings, but on the other side, the meetings over whatever, Zoom, WebEx, Teams, whatever your Doom tool is of your choice, they are exhausting, right? You end up in 5 or 6 hours of these meetings, and then you're more exhausted than in a regular meeting when you would have been in the office. So now you say, oh, people probably should have a day off. Don't do that on Fridays, or, you know, don't do it 6 hours a day. But then you want to have more communication. So now you have two very contradicting goals, right? How do you stay in contact with the people, but without overburden or overtaxing them? And I think in our case, the pendulum is swinging back and forth. We came now to the idea to do less of these meetings on Friday. So now you cramp them in the other days. Now we move them back to Fridays. It costs more time, and I think depending on the job, some of the productivity might be hindered. So I guess we have to figure out how that actually scales in big organizations and how you keep that under control. I mean, on the good side, I know now all the dogs and kids of my direct reports. And their furniture choice, so that has an entertainment value. But you can also see if they work on the kitchen table and people circling around them all day long, that's probably not helpful for them either. So not everyone is set up for permanent home office for sure.
Yeah. Interesting.
Probably no answer at all, but at least these.
There's some interesting points. Nina, how about yourself?
Well, I think my company have learned that, and I think they were probably going that way anyway at some point. But the pandemic definitely helped them realize that the good old software company policy of we need everybody to sit in the same office all day long and be innovative together is not necessarily the only way you can run a company. So it's actually been a change of policy during the pandemic that instead of requiring everybody to move to LA if they wanted to work for Subspace, we're now not requiring everybody to move to LA to work for Subspace, which I personally think is a really good thing. I don't want to live in LA. I had one more point. Sorry. I will raise my hand if my other point comes back into my head.
Okay. There's no more questions in the chat. Does anyone have any questions they'd want to ask before we close the call?
Yeah, so my original question that I was going to ask before Valeria raised that, and I suppose just on this point about what we've learned, I think from talking to INX members, what I've learned from this, the ones with the most rigid plans for their businesses are the ones who are suffering the most, because the inherent lack of flexibility in their planning, as in we are going to do this by this, by this, by this, has upended them. I think they're struggling, and the people whose mentality is requiring that sort of rigidity in what's going to happen in their lives, I think those are the people that I see have struggled the most emotionally, professionally, emotionally, but also their businesses are really struggling. And now they want a new permanent, full, proper plan, and they can't have that either. So it's that sort of requirement to expect the unexpected and to be able to maneuver around the unexpected, I think, are the people who are actually doing the best now, because it's like okay, so we were going to go that way and now we're just going to veer over this way and now we're going to veer over this way. And that ability, and I guess because INEX is such a small team, that's actually been sort of part of our nature anyway, is, you know, we do a less fancy version of what Kurtis is implementing, in that we do that on the fly because we're a small team. So it's that constant agile thing of, we need to move this way in order to shoot that way and we can come back. So I think those people are the ones that I see suffering the most. They suffer the most with not having people sitting in front of them doing exactly as they ask them to do and supervising them. So people who manage by supervision really struggle with the fact that they can't see people, or that somebody has a child sitting on their knee who's not at school. That sort of upends all of their concepts. But I wanted to ask, and one of the things that I was hoping to end up with out of the call is, for next year, obviously between now and Q4 next year is like 6,000 years away. And there is absolutely no way of any of us knowing whether or not you're Nina and CK, you know, purchasing services from somebody else. None of us know what's going to happen. And I just wonder, have you changed any, and perhaps more so because of INEX being similar to Mix and to LINX, have you changed the way that you're going to analyze things through the year? So yes, you have an imaginary budget for next year and things are going to work out according to that. But have you put in place any new analysis as time goes on to actually say, is this still likely to happen? Have you changed the way that you're going to analyze things next year, or is that just what you do anyway? And that's the bit that I'm kind of trying to figure out, is how much is too much of that analysis of, are we getting to where we thought we were getting to?
Let me jump in quickly. So I think from our side, on one side, we have changed the granularity in which we analyze data and assess situations. If they now result in better outcomes, we will see. But the framework, or, you know, what we intend to do for next year has not fundamentally changed. It is better, probably the key was a better understanding of your data, your services, your traffic behavior, all of these things, so that if they fundamentally change again, or, you know, a second lockdown has an impact, whatever might come, that we actually can react faster, so that the base data for your decisions are more there. I guess it's more that than actually changing the strategy.
So by the granularity thing, do you mean that you're less focused on how you're going to achieve something, the detail of that, and you're more of, we need to achieve this and we may have to change slightly the way we do it? Is that what you mean by the granularity, CK?
What we want to, how we achieve things, I think has probably stayed the same as it was before COVID, but now we have a better understanding which kind of customer has which traffic profile, and, you know, how the different services work in which regions, more broken down on, you know, whatever per region or server. So I think that understanding is better. So if a country goes into lockdown or changes fundamentally, then we can react better because we understand it better. But the way how we react is probably the same.
Okay.
I would say the same. We haven't our strategy hasn't fundamentally changed at all. I mean, that's fundamentally the same. But and it comes to delivery, how we deliver things is almost the same. But we do a lot more iterations. We put a lot more emphasis on monthly reforecasting and being much more. Well, I was going to say reactive, but I guess it's an element of being proactive, depending on what we think is happening around us in terms of planning.
Yes, we within the budget we are ready to postpone some of investment. So we are going to prepare a budget with a kind of flexibility and a window able to cover other lockdowns and so on. For example, for some investment related to the data center, I have to take in account that perhaps some part of them will be postponed later in relation to what I budgeted in the first phase. And but we didn't do so we introduced a flexibility in the budget, but not change the way how we approach it. Another aspect is related to the cash flow. So a particular we are paying a particular attention to the cash flow, dividing customers per categories, those that we think that could have matters in paying our invoices, and other that historically has no matter. So we are prepared to absorb in case some of the first category won't be able to pay. And also in this case, we are introducing some more flexibility in payments to allow small customers to be able to be connected. They need it. They need to be interconnected to an internet exchange, and without make mix in loss, of course.
Thank you.
Ning, do you have anything to add to that?
Did you ask me?
Oh yeah, sorry. Do you have anything to add to that? No.
No.
Eileen, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I think it's interesting, and it may have been something that Kurtis was doing anyway, the monthly revising. And that is, I suppose, you can overdo that. And that's what I wondered, whether or not that, or quarterly. I was trying to figure out where people's mentality was taking them of, how much revision you do, because otherwise you end up in chaos. If you revise too much, you end up with no plan because you're constantly changing the things. So, in terms of money and that kind of planning, it's trying to figure out where you're going to land at the end of next year is quite hard at the end of this year, because there's no certainty. And certainly we would see in our members, the ones who are the most vulnerable, who perhaps haven't had that issue this year because there has been so many people take up new broadband connections around the country. So they haven't seen it yet. But throughout the beginning of next year, we would expect the financial supports given by the government to start, possibly either tapering off, or people's annual costs of running their families and their family homes start meaning that they can't afford their broadband connection. So it's the long tail ones that we would see. And I think this is possibly similar to what Valeria was saying there. So it's the smaller providers that are the most vulnerable. And that's the, conversely, they're not the largest providers of the cash into the organization, but it's making sure that you keep everyone, balanced and connected.
I was going to say, and just to add, reply to that, we don't, just because we reforecast and take it stuck every month doesn't mean we change priorities every month. But you need to make sure that the forecast you have is still valid and the planning you have is still valid. And that's what we do. We stop every month and look at it. We also do, as part of the Scale Agile, the sprints are 2 weeks long. So every second week, there are sprints. You make a plan for an entire quarter for all the sprints. Even in the non-COVID time, that might not be the case, that you will have to reprioritize because of external factors and what have, delays or something. That work will have to change based on what goes around you. Right? You can't be that static and just write a plan and execute forever, because environment changes, right? And I think, as I said when I talked about the budgeting, I firmly believe that the macroeconomic environment is going to go worse before it gets better, and that is going to trickle down. As I said, we've had members early on who really struggled. Is they're not really necessary for LINX cash flow. They don't really affect our cash flow. They're so small that that's not a risk. We try to support them, but if this becomes a wider problem and we start seeing a lot of small business or similar ISPs and even cash flow crunching in towards the larger club players, then that might well become an issue. Right? As cash dries up, as furlough schemes ends, that's going to be a trickle down effect, right? And we don't know where that's going to end up. Right? That's going to be potentially a very harmful event, or at least an event that needs to be managed, right? And I think that is, if you look at when it tends to be when you have cash crunch, discretionary spending is the first to go. Right now, you could argue that broadband and online services is no longer discretionary spending. It's considered crucial to people's lives. I'm not 100% sure that's true. I think it's close to true. But will people pay the premium rates? No, they'll probably pay enough rates, right? There will be a limiting of factors, right? But I think it's not going to go away. The question is, will they continue to pay the 1 gigabit broadband, or are they going to go for the 100 megabit broadband? I mean, that's the factor, right? If you have no money and that's the choice between that or the toilet paper you can't buy anyway, then the choice might be quite simple, right? And I think those are the challenges in the coming 6 months, because when the furlough schemes dries up, that will become a real issue.
Yeah, one of the things actually they've been talking about here over the last week, and I don't know if this is an Irish thing or around the world, but they're looking at the impact of household saving, that essentially people are largely mattress banking. They're keeping cash that comes into the family, that is being held within the family and not released into the financial systems, into shops or discretionary spending. And that's the bit that I think here in Ireland, the economists are hoping that possibly starts to get released next year in tiny bits and actually starts keeping, that money flowing around the place. But it's
the problem is in many places in Europe, including the UK, that money is tied up into housing, right?
Yeah, and here
and that's not very liquid. You can't buy broadband for your house, unfortunately, and that's a real issue.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. That was a really interesting discussion. We are done with the panel, and also we've gone a little bit over time, but I think that was really interesting. I think there's lots of things we can take away from here. Planning is important, but making sure that you have some flexibility in your planning going forward. And communication really, really is key. I know it's probably one of the most obvious things to do during the pandemic, but it seems we were much better at it earlier on, and it seems to have slowly dried out. So communication and transparency, big things to take away. So with that, thank you, panelists. That was really, really interesting. Thank you for sharing your insight. I really enjoyed that. We've got a thank you from Michelle, and excellent hearing all the panelists, including Eileen as a guest from Luca there. So thank you all very much for your time. Of course, not just today, but for the prep beforehand and that. So thank you all very much. Thank you to the participants, and we'll see you all again soon. Have a great day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.